All right, and welcome back. So today we're going to get into the high point of the Renaissance. There's a couple of things that define the high Italian Renaissance. The first is that we're somewhere around the year 1500. 10 years either side of the year 1500 is what's going to define the Italian High Renaissance. The other thing that defines it is that it moves away from Florence. As I've already mentioned, the Medicis have a turn of fortune in that Lorenzo de' Medici dies, and the Medicis end up being exiled. We have this mad monk by the name of Savonarola come to power, and he absolutely hates all of this classical art, wants to burn it all down. He actually gathers a few devotees. Even Sandro Botticelli becomes one of his devotees. But his reign is short-lived. But it does have the effect of pushing arts out of the region of Florence and out into other areas. So if the first half of the Quattrocento were consolidating arts in Florence, and the second half of the Quattrocento, it's going to be out. By the end of the Quattrocento, we're moving out. And so where's the money? Where you got to follow the money, and the money is going to be in places like Venice. Venice is a growing banking and shipping concern, lots of textile merchants, lots of growth there, but also places like Milan, and predominantly Rome. Rome has the papacy, and the Pope's got bling. He's got the money to pay for all of this, so that's where a lot of the attention is going to go. So let's talk about, the great artists that we identify as these kind of hallmarks of the Renaissance. And the first, of course, is going to be Leonardo da Vinci. So Leonardo da Vinci, as his name suggests, comes from the region of Vinci, and he's active in Florence, but also in Milan. He comes under the patronage of the Duke of Milan, and this is kind of an interesting arrangement. Again, I can't stress enough how important the concept of patronage is. If you are an artist and you are under the patronage of a duke or a lord or a wealthy individual, it is not just like he's your client. We live in a world where if you want to be an artist, all you have to do is hang up your shingle, open an Etsy store, and away you go. You don't even have to do any formal training. If you can get people to buy your stuff, you're an artist. We live in an age of the free market and of the complete democratization of art, but that was not the way it was in the 15th and 16th century. You had to have somebody who was a client, somebody who was a patron who would pay for you. Art supplies are expensive. You can't go out to Hobby Lobby to go get them. You have to buy them from specialized merchants. You have to make them yourselves in many cases. That requires a lot of apprentices. That means you have to have a big workshop. All of this takes money. You got to feed all those people, keep them all paid, and that means you have to have a patron. You have to have wealthy clients who are willing to pay you. And the biggest clients are going to be nobles and the church. Those are the people who have the bucks to pay for this kind of thing, and you're pretty much at their beck and call. Towards the end of his life, Leonardo da Vinci actually goes to Paris, but he doesn't necessarily go willingly. He goes because the Duke of Milan owed the King of France a favor, and he's like, okay, here, take Leonardo. And you pretty much don't have a choice. You have to go. And so he does travel up north to Paris for a while. But he has a wide breadth of interests. And it's funny because Leonardo da Vinci is not a terribly prolific painter. Many of the painters we've talked about produced 100 or more paintings. Leonardo da Vinci had produced far fewer. He was not a terribly prolific painter. What we know him more is for his ideas and his concepts, particularly his sketchbooks. We know his sketchbooks in detail because he would make these incredible anatomical studies. Now, a lot has been made of his anatomical studies. It's not true that you had to illegally get bodies to do this and that it was illegal to do anatomical studies. You could legally do it, and as near as we can tell, Leonardo da Vinci legally got bodies to dissect. They had to be criminals or condemned men to do this. He would get the bodies after they died, so it's not like he was a grave robber or anything. A lot of that is overplayed. Still, it was not, necessarily approved of in polite behavior, in polite society, that you dissect corpses. Doctors and artists were just beginning this investigation into human anatomy. But it was very necessary because he wanted to understand the forms of the human body. He wanted to approach his art from a full disegno approach. That is, that he wanted to understand not just the object, but the form and the function of the object. This is very similar to the 5th century BC, where in Greece you see this enlightening understanding of the human body, not just as a collection of parts, but of a series of systems. So he took great interest in all of this, even to the point of creating these somewhat fanciful illustrations of a child in utero. Now, over here on the right, we have one of the most famous images of Leonardo da Vinci, and that's the Vitruvian Man. Vitruvius was a writer of the 2nd century. In Roman times. He was an architect and an artist, and he wrote a series of works known as the 10 Books of Architecture. In those books, he details ideal proportions for architecture and for human beings. And so this was an attempt, again, that's one of the things that distinguishes the Italian Renaissance, to rediscover the classical past. It's this sense of historicism, this sense of research of the classical past. So when you see this Vitruvian Man, you can see that Leonardo da Vinci is trying to recreate the sense of ideal proportions that existed in the classical past. As it turns out, he got it completely wrong. Probably not his fault. Leonardo da Vinci was actually working from a very bad translation of Vitruvius that got the numbers and the formulas for human proportions wrong. So when he tried to create an illustration of this, he messed it up. But he was trying to go with this concept of the idea that man is the measure of all things and create these ideal sets of proportions. But his interest didn't stop there. He had interests in things such as fluid dynamics, where he would study standing waves and in rivers and in streams. You can tell what he could have done with a slow motion camera. He's interpreting what he's seeing, trying to create order of it. And of course, everybody is absolutely transfixed by his many, many machines, from his sketches and possibilities of flying contraptions of a variety of kinds. This is perhaps one of his most famous studies. This is the study for a horse, a monumental horse that he never finished. The horse was the symbol of the Sforza family. That was the family that he was employed at Milan, and he was trying to make this. It was supposed to be a 40-foot high bronze horse, and he worked on it tirelessly through all of his life and never ever finished it. Leonardo da Vinci was said to have been critical of what Michelangelo was doing in the Sistine Chapel, and Michelangelo quipped back, yeah, how's the horse going? Because people knew that he'd been struggling with it his entire life. What's interesting is we actually have a copy of Leonardo da Vinci's resume, which is interesting. He actually writes it to the Duke of Milan, and it has something like, let me just check my notes here, 11 different points of all the things that he could do for the Duke of Milan, and only 2 of them have to do with art. In one case he says, I can paint as well as any man, but most of his discussion is about what he can do for him technologically. I mean, in part 11 he says, I can carry out sculpture in marble, bronze, or clay, and also I can do in painting whatever may be done as well as any other, be he who he may. Again, the bronze horse may be taken in hand, which is to be the immortal glory and eternal honor of the prince, your father, of happy memory, and of the illustrious house of Sforza. So, of which he never actually finished. But if you read this resume of his, he actually talks more about things like mortars, cannons, bombardments, bridges, engineering. He was really selling himself as a man of many trades. Not as just an artist, but as a kind of magister, a person who had mastery of many different technical trades. And that's what he did for Sforza. There's this interesting thing that happens, and you can see this continuing into the 17th century with Galileo, that you see that these noblemen start collecting men who are not just artists, but men of science, who are true intellectuals, to try to advance their own reputation. So that's why we think of Leonardo da Vinci as kind of the Renaissance man, as this person who has all of these traits and gifts. Well, despite the fact that he didn't complete many paintings, his paintings are rather marvelous. and he is the person most known for this concept of sfumato. Sfumato literally means smoking, kind of smoke-like. He would paint in these many transparent glazes to blend out or soften the edges of the transitions. You can see in this example how this works. This is the Madonna of the Rocks, and it exists in two versions. One in the National Gallery in London and the other one in the Louvre. And you can see that in both, he's created this incredible depth through this smoky kind of quality. You can see the atmospheric perspective in the background, but when we look at details of the figures, you can see especially how we have this blending of the edges. Let me just kind of highlight it here for you, that when you see the transition from the shadow edge to the face, you can see how incredibly soft and well blended that is. Same here down in the neck, also in the body of Christ, the Christ child, how he creates these very deep dark shadows and how they blend, and how he isn't defining really hard edges. Instead, he's allowing those edges, even the edge of the hair, to blend into the background. He thought that this was more closely approximated the way we actually saw things, which is true. You know, if you look at something, there's not a lot of hard edges. If you are a photographer, you realize how, you know, you put something onto a black background, things can actually disappear. And so you don't want to emphasize the edges, you want to emphasize these subtle gradations and transitions. And he achieves this by lots and lots and lots of underpainting. And we have quite a few unfinished Leonardos. In fact, there's dozens of unfinished Leonardos that never ever quite got finished, and it's great because it reveals his process to us. We can see in this one how he paints the lighter tones, the gray, the grisaille, underneath this to create this tonality, and then layer by layer he builds this up. We can see in some of his portraits how he does this. This one is such an interesting portrait because, as you can see, it has a very nice, fine surface finish. You can see all these beautiful little tight curls on her face. You can also see all the little leaves on the juniper bush behind her. But inside her face, she has these incredibly subtle tones. This is a portrait of Ginevra da Benci, and in this case, he has decided to do this wonderful visual pun. Ginevra means white, and it's related to the word juniper, for juniper bush, which has little white or blue-white berries. And so it's not accidental that she has this incredible alabaster skin, this flawless alabaster skin, but then around her, her head is framed from the background by a juniper bush. So he's made this wonderful visual pun that exists here. This is the only Leonardo da Vinci in the Western Hemisphere. This one's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and it's one of his best works. If you get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., go out and check it. Even then, we know that it was painted on panel, and it probably was cut down from a larger panel. There's a painting on the back. He understood that, you know, if you only paint one side, that causes warpage. So he painted both sides and painted this motif on the back with the slogan and the various plants, all referencing her. And we can imagine that this would have been a full bust portrait, but now what we have here is just the only top of the portrait. This is very typical of the way that he would go about portraits. This incredible skin tone is the product of many, many layers of painting. For example, you can see in this painting, Lady with an Ermine, you can see how subtle the gradations are in her flesh. Take a look at this cheek, for example. You have such subtle gradations across this cheek. The line that indicates the shadow edge and the midtones has just been, you know, very much obliterated. That's that sfumato, this kind of very hazy, gradual painting. And this is typical of all of Leonardo da Vinci's finished works, which brings us to his most famous work, La Gioconda, more commonly known as the Mona Lisa, currently in the Louvre. Now, when we look at this painting, it doesn't have that kind of surface finish. You can certainly, when you look at the enigmatic smile, see all of those subtle gradations and tones, that exist, but it isn't a finished painting. That's one of the things that's really interesting about this painting. It's remarked upon as being the most famous and the greatest of all of Leonardo da Vinci's portraits, and yet, for most of its history, it was regarded as a minor, unfinished painting by Leonardo da Vinci. We're not entirely certain how this wound up in the collection of the Louvre, but presumably when Leonardo da Vinci went to Paris, he left several works there. He had an apprentice, Sale. Sale probably inherited many of his unfinished paintings and eventually sold them off. That's our most likely provenance for the origin of this painting. But this painting then entered into the royal collection, and for 300 years it was seldom remarked on, except as an obvious unfinished painting. It was only later that it got built up into this great masterpiece. But you can clearly see it's unfinished when we compare it to something like the Ginevra de Benici. When you take a look at it, the Ginevra de Benici has very thin eyebrows, but she very clearly has eyebrows. The Mona Lisa doesn't have eyebrows. The Ginevra de Benici has very detailed curls. These are all surface details painted on all of those layers of underpainting. You can see that none of those surface details or highlights are present in the hair of the Mona Lisa. And when you look to the background looks very gauzy. None of that precision is there. So it's hard to believe that he would have left the Mona Lisa in this state intentionally. It's most likely that this is an unfinished painting. It's more finished than some of the other unfinished paintings, but he never ever got around to that last final finished layer, and her flesh probably would have been a lot lighter in tone, and she certainly could have had her eyebrows. All of this begs the question, why is this then the most famous painting in the world? And this is a good lesson for us in art history. There's many stories about how this thing got to be the most famous painting in the world. One story says that Napoleon brought it into his room when he became the Emperor of France, and that elevated its status. Another one is that it got stolen, and that became a sensation, and that elevated its status. Those may or may not be true, but the biggest thing is that it was art historians who elevated its status. In the 19th century, France was the center of the art world, and by that point, Leonardo was this recognized master. And my gosh, here was the Louvre, and it didn't have a Leonardo da Vinci. And somebody remembered, wait a minute, don't we have that unfinished Leonardo? And so this thing got elevated into the pinnacle of Leonardo's art. So much to the point that you can't even get close to the thing. It's under 2 inches of bulletproof glass, and there's usually a throng of tourists. But it does beg the question, do we sometimes value paintings too much? Do we value these paintings because of their inherent worth, or do we value them because of the stories we've told about them and what they've come to mean to us culturally? The Ginevra de Benici, not a very famous painting, but the Mona Lisa is world famous, and yet the Ginevra de Benici probably gives you a more accurate idea of what a Leonardo da Vinci is supposed to look like. That isn't to say the Mona Lisa is a bad painting. Even an unfinished Leonardo is a masterpiece, and you can clearly see the workings of his style. But the thing that she's most famous for, her enigmatic smile, is so subtle it might very well have vanished in the final layers of paint. And so the things that we think are important may not have been so nearly important to the artist at all. It's always an important lesson. Are you reacting to the hype, or are you reacting to the actual painting? My opinion, skip the Mona Lisa when you go to the Louvre. You can't see it anyway because it's behind too many people. And instead go to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. and go take a look at the Ginevra. It's a much more representative example of what this beautiful, very subtle underpainting and gradation, what this sfumato does to a painting. The Mona Lisa is a beautiful painting, sure, go see it for its cultural value, but not the best representation of Leonardo da Vinci. A far better representation of Leonardo da Vinci, of course, is going to be The Last Supper. So The Last Supper is painted in Milan, and it's actually painted in the refectory of a convent. So this would have been a church that had monks. I know we think of convents as being for nuns and monasteries for being men, but that's kind of an English convention. Convent can be for monks or nuns, it doesn't matter. So a refectory is just a cafeteria. It's a cafeteria for monks. So this is a place where monks would go to eat. So it makes sense that a fresco would be painted that would have relevance to the site. That's one thing that we always miss about these works of art, is they're always contextual to the site, particularly religious works of art. We take these altarpieces and we remove them from churches and we put them in museums, and we actually kind of strip them of a lot of their meaning. This is really true of non-Western art. When we take sacred artifacts from temples and other art places and we place them into context where we appreciate them as art, we really lose that context. But hey, Western civilization, we not only rape other cultures, we rape our own culture. And so we remove these things from context and don't realize it. So again, think about this from the perspective of a monk sitting here. You are a monk, you are eating a meal, and you see this image of the Last Supper, this very famous meal with Christ and his apostles, the last meal with Christ and his apostles. And so it's supposed to remind you of who you are supposed to be emulating, the kind of person you're supposed to be. The painting is a fresco, but it was an experimental fresco. Leonardo da Vinci was always experimenting with technique. He painted on a thin layer of plaster that was applied to linen. He thought this would give him more of a texture like oil painting and give him some of the qualities of oil painting. Unfortunately, that linen is disintegrating and this thing is crumbling off of the surface. That's really too bad. Leonardo da Vinci was an incredible experimenter, and most of his experiments failed. This one is by far not his worst failure. His worst failure was the lost mural of the Battle of Anghiari, which was this massive mural of a battle scene with war horses that he painted down in Florence. And he didn't want the chalky quality of fresco, so he was trying to use oil paints to produce this. He was trying to combine fresco and oil paints. But oil paints, as we mentioned, don't dry very fast, and the oil paint was actually starting to drip off the walls before it had a chance to fully dry. And so he decided to bring in smudge pots. Smudge pots are these braziers full of coals that produce smoke and heat. You put them in orchards to keep your fruit trees from freezing. And he thought, okay, well, if I bring those in, that'll heat up the wall and dry off the paint faster. And instead what it did is it made the paint melt faster. And so the paint melted, slid off the walls, caught fire, and burned, which is about as big a fail as you could possibly have in a painting. This one is unfortunately deteriorating, but it probably will survive. It's been under a recent massive restoration, so hopefully it will hold together for a while. Right off the bat, though, you can see that Leonardo has moved us into a different direction. Notice that we have no halos. There's no heavy symbolism to indicate what's going on. Instead, he uses the compositional strengths of the painting to indicate what's important. I often tell my students that if you were an alien anthropologist and you came and you saw this painting, you couldn't mistake who the most important people are in it, because all of the perspective lines converge right on the center of this guy in the middle. So you know that he's important. This is, of course, Christ. His head is also completely framed in the open window, and all of the people either side are interacting with him, so you know that he's important. Now, as we look at this, there is a kind of single line that divides this composition, and it's the edge of the table. When you look at this, you see that the apostles are not just there, standing randomly, but they're grouped into threes. Here's a small lesson of why you should always check your spell checker. I had a student write a paper about this, and instead of saying that the apostles were grouped by threes, he said they were groped by threes. Well, I guess we now know why it was the Last Supper. Judas, watch your hands! Anyhow. The apostles are grouped by threes, and you can tell by their expressions they're agitated. They're having these wild, animated conversations. And that tells you what's going on in the painting. It tells you that, hey, something is going on. They're all in a state of shock. You have people putting their finger up in the air, people kind of gesturing. Did you hear what he said? this person is doing the Neil deGrasse Tyson meme, you know, hand gesture over here for holy crap. And so you know that something is going on. And that lets us know that what's happening here is this dramatic moment in the Last Supper, the dramatic moment when Christ announces to everyone that one of the disciples will betray him. So they're all in this state of agitation. Is it me? Is it me? Who is it? You'll notice that there's one group, however, that is a little different. That's this group here. Notice their heads are lower than all of the other heads of the apostles. Notice also that this guy here, his arm breaks that line. He's actually further forward than anyone else in the composition. And again, that's not accidental. Also, when we look to this group, notice that the one character here, right here, he isn't agitated. He is just leaning away and is resigned to this information that has been given to him. And this, of course, is John the Beloved. Now, the story as given in the New Testament is that John the Beloved was sitting in the bosom of Christ. People in the ancient world didn't sit at tables. They lounged around on the floor or on cushions or on couches. And so, you know, you sit down on the floor in the Middle East, and if you don't have a chair, you just lean up to the person next to you. I've been in many Arabic homes, and the custom still exists today, so you just have to get used to that in your getting rid of the kind of large body buffer zones that we have in the United States. So Christ would have been leaning into Jesus. So there's this moment in the story from the New Testament where Christ says, one of you will betray me, and because John is leaning in close to Jesus, he can kind of say, hey, you know, who is it? And Jesus says, it's the person that I'm eating out of the same dish with. So you can actually see that Jesus is reaching out here for a dish, and then we have this character here who's reaching for the same dish. So this, of course, would be Judas. So that's why John's not overreacting, because he knows. And of course, then you have Peter with his typical short hair and beard coming in saying, hey, what did Jesus say to you? And of course, Judas isn't reacting because he knows. So you have this kind of interesting dynamic that's being created here. What I love also about this is when you look at this, you'll notice that we have some very interesting lighting choices. The light predominantly is coming from this side, but there's also a kind of softer global light that's radiating away from Christ. Christ is uniformly lit. You can see that the characters here are lit from his direction. So you see that the light is traveling this direction. These figures, you can see the light on the back of their head, but their faces are still pretty uniformly lit. And of course, when we look to John and Peter, their faces are uniformly lit, except this guy here. This guy is right next to Jesus. He's looking right at him, and his face is still in shadow. And because he's leaning forward on the table, because his face is in shadow, that's a clear indication he's not with the rest of them. Something is unique about him. So if you were one of these alien anthropologists, you would say, hey, not only is the guy in the center important, but something is going on with this guy. He's shady. And this is, of course, Judas. He's clutching the money bag, the 30 coins that he's sold out Jesus for. So what I love about this painting is that without using heavy-handed iconography, without using any kind of overwhelming symbolism or pointing arrows, he has still managed to direct our eye to the most important features and uses color and light and tone and composition to tell you a whole story here that you can even figure out even if you don't know the whole story. It's really quite incredible and shows why Leonardo is quite the master. Well, that will bring us to Michelangelo. Michelangelo Buonarroti, you don't have to know the full name, everybody knows him by Michelangelo, Mike to his friends, was again a Florentine sculptor and painter. He was under the patronage of the Medici family, but he also is patronized by Pope Julius II. If you read through Vasari's Lives of the Artists, Michelangelo has the biggest chapter. He has the biggest chapter of all of the other artists, and he was actually still alive when Vasari wrote his Lives of the Artists. In fact, you can tell Vasari is kind of fanboying on Michelangelo a bit. And all of the characteristics that we associate with the genius artist, all of the characteristics that we associate with the genius artist, a person who is kind of stubborn, obstreperous, obnoxious, a loner, you know, no one understands him, he's got poor hygiene because he's so committed to his work. All of those things come from Vasari's description of Michelangelo. So if you thought you were, you know, the OG artist, I'm sorry, you know, you're not. Michelangelo set that prototype. And so all these negative personality traits get interpreted as signs of his genius. Certainly, he was definitely a tortured soul. Later, when he paints The Last Judgment, there's a strong argument to be made that the face here on the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew is in fact the face, a self-portrait of Michelangelo. So guy had issues, no doubt. Very complicated, very difficult figure to get along with. He was also something of a kind of prodigy. When he was very young, in his late teens, early 20s, he got a number of prominent commissions. One prominent commission was to a French cardinal down in the Vatican, and he sculpted a Cupid figure. This brought him to the attention of larger clients, and this is what got him his first major commission. This is the Pietà, and of course one of the most famous sculptures in the world. Several famous sculptures, several of the most famous sculptures in the world are all Michelangelo's. That shows how important he was. Here we have an image of the Virgin Mary holding Christ and the dead body of Christ after Christ has been taken down from the cross. We might call this a lamentation or a deposition scene. Its origins are actually in the Middle Ages, though. Over on the left, we have a Vesper build. So if you were a Christian, and I said this to my 2710 class, but I'll just reiterate it here. If you were a Christian in the Middle Ages, you were expected to pray 9 times a day. You would pray before morning, midday, mid-morning, noon, afternoon, evening, and again a few more times in the evening, and once in the middle of the night. It was really kind of tedious. And these were the offices of prayer. And every single thing that you prayed, every day when you prayed, you would pray and focus on one of the mysteries of the life of Mary or Christ. So say, for example, you were saying Matins. Matins is the prayer you're supposed to say just before dawn. And Matins is dedicated to contemplating the mystery of the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel announces to the Virgin Mary that she's going to be the mother of Christ. And so since that event was believed to happen in the early morning, that's what you would contemplate. So your life would parallel the life of Mary and Christ. Well, Christ is supposed to be crucified in the afternoon, and he dies around 3 in the afternoon. And then sometime after that, his body would have been taken down from the cross just before dusk. So the prayer you're supposed to say just before dusk is Vespers, and that's the Vesper prayer. And so you need an image to contemplate this moment of Christ's life, his death, and that he died for you. And so that is a Vesper build. That is an image to help you get through the Vesper prayer. And so that's what this image is over here on the left. And you can see that it's very much focused in on this concept of grief. Mary has a furrowed brow. You can tell that she is an older woman. The body of Christ is just emaciated and broken. You can see this incredible gash on his chest from where the spear pierced his side. His head is lolling back, his mouth is open, his eyes are rolling back in his skull. He looks terrible. There's this incredible overbalance to the figures, as if Mary is struggling to keep the body of Christ on her lap. There's obvious parallels to the image of Madonna and the child, where, you know, she held him as a child, now she's holding him as an adult, but she can barely do it. Everything about this is meant to emphasize the qualities of grief, and this, for the viewer, is supposed to emphasize your personal penance. And then you get to Mikey's version, and it's completely different. It doesn't have this sense of grief, or certainly not grief in the same way. When we look at this scene, the first thing you have to recognize is that Mary is freaking ginormous. I mean, that's her toes right there, and that's her knee right there, and that's her head. She's huge. I don't know. I mean, you know, she's like Hagrid's mom. I mean, she's incredibly big. So instead of being, you know, a little woman that is overwhelmed by the size of the body of Christ, she's this massive pyramidal figure. Instead of Christ falling or slipping off of her lap, she easily holds him. I mean, heck, she doesn't even have to bring her other hand into it. She has this kind of really strong pyramidal form. So instead of being overbalanced or overhanging like here, everything is contained and perfectly balanced. The other thing you'll notice about Mary is that she's not overly grieved. She looks contemplative, not sad. Everybody grieves in a different way, I guess, but she's also young. She looks very, very young. She's not an older woman. She's an idealized female. And now let's look at the body of Christ himself. The body of Christ in this case, you know, he's dead, but he doesn't look terribly dead. I mean, you know, look at him. He's got great abs, you know, he's got some good muscles. Maybe he does CrossFit, I don't know. But he is not the broken, emaciated figure that we see over here. He's pretty heroic. He's pretty built. And instead of his head being, you know, kind of lolling off to the side, it's just kind of back. You could almost imagine him as if he's sleeping. So while the original idea here certainly comes from this Vesper build, you can see that Michelangelo has reinterpreted it. And so what is he trying to say? By making Mary this idealized classical figure, by making Christ this very kind of muscular, heroic figure. And I think that the intent here is to change the theme. Instead of this being a theme of grief, this is a theme of triumph. Well, where does he get this idea? Well, in the Greek tradition, Greek warriors were born off of the battlefield by gods and goddesses, like sleep and death. Hypnos and Thanatos were gods and goddesses that, you know, would carry the bodies off of the battlefield. And this is a very old classical idea. It's very similar to the Valkyries taking the heroes of Norse myth off of the battlefield, if you're a fan of the latest God of War. Anyhow, so it seems to be that that's the intent here. Rather than Mary being a mother grieving over the body of Christ, she becomes almost a figure displaying the body of Christ. And Christ becomes not this image of grief and penance, but an image of triumph. He is the hero that has died in battle, but ultimately, you know, gives way to the triumph of the resurrection. And this is where you start to see this classicism and this humanism really start to fuse with the Judeo-Christian tradition. Well, this cemented his reputation, and according to legend, it was so widely praised for its beauty and its power that he came in and he signed his name across the sash, which was very odd. Remember, artists didn't sign their works of art. Works of art were, you know, made for the patron, and that was what mattered. You know, the artists were not seen as that important, but he was kind of a cheeky guy, and so he could get away with that. Whether that's true or not, we're not entirely certain, but that's the story as it's told. Well, this elevated his reputation to such a degree that he returned to his native Florence, and this is where he begins to get most of his major commissions. And that's where we come upon this next great work of art. That is Michelangelo's David. So Michelangelo's David is a story that has kind of a miraculous understanding. To understand this, you have to know a little bit about the history of Florence. Florence was a small city, but it was a very powerful city, and in the Quattrocento it was rising. It was become the major power. But a century or two before, Siena was the major power. But so Florence really wanted to, you know, exemplify this new age of culture. And so the plan was that they were going to carve the patron saints of the city, the characters from the Bible and from Christian tradition that were the mascots, as you were, of the city. And they were going to carve these huge 40-foot statues of them, and they were going to place them on the Duomo, on the cathedral of the city. The project got started, but it quickly fell apart. They cut an enormous block of marble, but the marble, when it was dragged to the location, was discovered to have a flaw. And this flaw split the block from top to bottom. It had a single crack, which means that instead of a really big block of marble, you had two thin slabs, relatively thin slabs, that were considered, not so great. So the marble got pushed off to the side and left there for, gosh, a generation or more. And they quickly forgot about the project. But recently, they put a copy of the statue to show where these things were intended to go. So they were intended to be these colossal statues, and they needed to be colossal because if you're looking up at the cathedral way up in the sky, 100 feet up so in the sky, they need to be big enough to see. So Michelangelo comes along and he sees this flawed block of marble, and according to legend, he stares at it and he stares at it and he stares at it. He doesn't do anything, he just looks at it from all sides and all directions, and he just thinks about it. Eventually, people begin to worry about him and say, hey, wait a minute, Mikey, why are you staring at the marble so long? And he says, well, I'm sculpting. And what he was doing is, in his mind, he was looking at the flawed piece of marble and trying to imagine, how do I cut a working statue out of this? And the statue that he produced out of this was, in fact, the David statue that we know. And it was instantly regarded as a marvelous statue, but it was marvelous for two reasons. One, it's just a beautiful statue. It's an incredible accomplishment. But two, because it was made out of this flawed piece of marble, people were like, wow, it was kind of a miracle on top of it that he took a flawed piece of marble and turned it into this and cut around the flaw so that the flaw did not go through the marble. As you look at the sculpture today, it's meant mostly to be looked at from the front, but in fact, if you look at it from the side, he doesn't have much of a tush. He's kind of thin in the hips, and that's because he was having to work within the constraints of the marble that he had, but still pretty nice. It's also important because people comment on how the hands are so large and the head is large and they're disproportionately large to the building. But I always like to remind people, this was meant to stick up on a top of a building, and if you are looking up at a building, like you look up at him in this gaze, as you look up this direction, the head doesn't seem quite so large and the hands don't seem quite so large. So there's a little bit of forced perspective. He was aware of the context that this was having to go into, so he wanted to make sure that those features were seen. As it turns out, they never put it on the cathedral. People loved it so much that they decided to put it right downtown, right in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, which is the city hall of Florence. And it stood there for many centuries. And eventually they moved it. What you see when you go there today is a replica. In the 18th century, it was clear that it was starting to get eroded from weather and pigeons and just incidental things, so they removed it from that location and they took it to the Accademia, and it's stood there ever since. And that's where you can go see it today. So what you see out in front of the Palazzo Pubblica is a replica, and the original is now indoors where it can be protected and enjoyed by everyone. And it became an emblem of the city. Again, David is the shepherd boy who, took on Goliath, and he's the ultimate underdog. And so Florence saw themselves as an underdog, so David became that kind of emblem for them. But there's something more going on here. Yeah, he's David, but there's really, honestly, not much here to identify this guy as David. You can see that he does hold the sling. You can see the sling in his left hand, and if you look at his back, there he is with his small booty. You can see the sling is across the back, and if you look very carefully in his hand, you can see the stones. But that's about it. That's the only thing that indicates that this is David. Everything else about this pretty much indicates nothing about his identity. In fact, the sling is hardly even visible as you look at it from the front, and it's obvious that it's meant to be viewed primarily from the front. And so the question then becomes, okay, if this is David, what is the narrative here? If you remember the statues by Donatello and by Verrocchio, they're clearly standing on the head of Goliath. So they are just finished killing Goliath and cut off his head with his own sword. But here, has he killed Goliath? Has he going to kill Goliath? Is he thinking about killing Goliath? There's really no answer to that question. He stands there to be admired, and he in fact is kind of timeless. There is no real concrete sense of the narrative of when happens. People have suggested that this hard sideward glance and the furrowed brow is the moment just before he enters into battle, but it's really hard to know that for certain. What we can say is that the figure here, the prototype of the standing beautiful figure, is in fact borrowed probably from images of the god Apollo. He has his hair gathered in these curls. This is what the ancients would have called hyacinth hair. If you know hyacinth flowers gather together in bunches. So this was one of these poetic ways that the ancient Greek poets would talk about their gods and heroes with hyacinth hair. So he has this loosely massed curls of hairs. He has this very strong Greek profile. If anything, he looks more like the god Apollo than he looks like David. And I think that's intentional, and that makes sense. And it works because he becomes a kind of dual mascot. David, because Florence saw itself as the underdog, and it's a kind of rightful rulers, and so they inherited this from David. David is also known as the person who founds a kind of golden age in the Bible. But Apollo is the god of arts and sciences in the Greek tradition. And so not only are they saying, hey, we are this underdog, but we are ushering in a new golden age of arts and sciences. And I think that's why they very much liked it. So this cements Michelangelo's reputation as something of a rock star in the art world, and he becomes very known for his sculpture for this reason. And it's this reputation that gets him his next gig, which is going to be probably the most famous gig he ever has, which is the Sistine Chapel. And he does this for Pope Julius II. Here's the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is a smaller chapel in the Vatican off of the St. Peter's. Here you can see it. And he is responsible for the ceiling. Now, and he's also responsible for the far wall. This is the Last Judgment on this side, and this is the ceiling. He painted the ceiling first, and he comes back to do the Last Judgment, 25 years later. On the side walls are various paintings by Botticelli, Perugino, etc. A lot of great art in the Sistine Chapel. Despite what everybody tells you, he didn't lie on his back and paint this. He actually wrote letters to his friends, and in his letters he actually shows a little doodle of himself standing and craning his neck back. You can't hardly imagine it. Now, the funny thing is that when he came to Rome, he didn't come to paint the Sistine Chapel. In fact, he came to do the tomb of the popes. Pope Julius wanted this magnificent pyramidal-like structure that had a series of sculptures on it, and also had images of various saints and figures out of the Bible. Now, Michelangelo thought of himself as a sculptor, and so that's what he came to do. But this never got finished. In fact, only one sculpture was ever completely finished from it, and that is the Moses sculpture here. This one's now in St. Peter in Vincoli, but it was meant to be part of the tomb of the popes, and never ever was finished. Here you can see that intense sideward gaze. Notice that Moses has horns. That's the traditional way that he's depicted, because in the Latin Vulgate they translated the rays of light that are supposed to come off of Moses' face, because Moses has been in the presence of God, and St. Jerome interpreted that as horns of light, and so that's what those are supposed to represent. It's kind of strange, but there it is. But he never ever actually got to finish most of this, and that's because Julius II had a long laundry list of stuff he needed Michelangelo to do first. Remember patronage. You do not own yourself. You're subject to your patron's whims. And so if your patron says, yeah, before you can get work on that other thing, I need you to go paint my bedroom, you gotta go paint his bedroom, and you got no choice. So the Sistine Chapel was a chapel There was a medieval chapel. It's located right here. So this is the Vatican looking down. This is St. Peter's Square here, and this is St. Peter's, and then the Vatican is all of this. Here is it looking from the top of St. Peter's right there. Now originally when this thing was created, it had a ceiling of blue with gold stars, very similar to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which was traditional in the Trecento. But they wanted something more impressive, and so Julius II, this was the chapel that the popes used for all of their official business. When they were doing major things, they would do it over at St. Peter's, but St. Peter's didn't exist yet. They were still old St. Peter's there. But this was the primary official chapel of the Pope. And in fact, it still holds that capacity. So this is a scene of the conclave. So whenever a pope dies, they have to get together and choose a new pope. All the cardinals come together, and the Sistine Chapel is where they do it. I was actually there in 2005 for the conclave that chose Ratzinger as Pope Benedict XVI. And boy, was it tough, because they shut the whole Vatican down. I was doing research, and I couldn't even go to the Vatican because the whole thing was shut down. Tourists who'd spent their whole lives hoping to get there couldn't get there because the Sistine Chapel was actually being used for its official purpose. It's not just there for tourists. It's there to have this official purpose. So this is the room where they choose the popes. And they lock all the cardinals in there, and that's what conclave means, is conclave, to lock it up with a key so they don't get to come out. They actually bring in their food. They actually bring in portable showers and other things so that, you know, they stay there until the new pope is chosen. So this is the conclave from St. Francis after he was chosen. So Julius II wanted this ceiling to kind of represent his view. Julius was a humanist pope. He really was this avid scholar of classical tradition, so he didn't have objections to classical nudes in the way that other popes or other religious leaders might have. And that's really an important point. You kind of have to, in the Middle Ages, have this prime mix of patron and artist. And so Julius II and Michelangelo become this kind of small team of rivals, where Julius II would constantly be pestering Michelangelo to do his job, and Michelangelo would constantly chafe back at the two. At one time, Michelangelo wanted to go back to see some family and attend the Feast of St. Luke, which was very important to the guild of St. Luke in Florence. And the Pope says, if I let you go, when are you ever going to finish my ceiling? And Michelangelo said, well, I'll finish it someday. And the Pope said, someday, someday, and began caning him over the top of the head with his crozier, his little Pope staff. So, you know, pretty intense to get caned by a Pope. But the relationship, as tumultuous and as difficult as it was, produced one of the greatest masterpieces of Western art. So, hey, into every life a little rain must fall. When we look at this, it's really quite complicated. We have a series of rectangular panels in the middle, and then you have these little triangular sections, which are vaults that go to the windows, and then triangular sections in between them. Here's a diagram to help explain it, but basically in the center section, you have the story of the creation and the flood, with the creation taking this half, and the flood taking this section here. Then in the little triangular sections, in the sections between, you have prophets who prophesied about Christ. Prophets and sibyls, we'll get to that. And then the rest of it is stories from the ancestors of Christ. Of course, all of the major figures, like David, etc., are ancestors to Christ, and so this has, even though it doesn't have an image of Christ in it, is focused on how the Old Testament ultimately leads to the revelation of Christ. Now, when we look at this thing, it was actually done in two major phases. The first phase took place up through about 1510, 1511, and in that time, most of the work only proceeded on this section right here. It's kind of remarkable to think that it took that long. Michelangelo did not think of himself as a painter, and he struggled. In fact, sometimes the plaster was too wet. Fresco, you paint on wet plaster, and if it's too wet, it falls off the ceiling. If it's too dry, then the paint can't combine with it correctly. And he struggled and had to redo large sections of it, so he was learning as he went. So he did this section first, put up the scaffolding, and did that look at it. And when we look at it, this shows really complex narrative scenes about the life of Noah. So the very center scene shows the flood. This is the ark, and it has the usual continuous narrative. Here is Noah releasing a bird, but you can see all of these people dying. Many of these figures are borrowed straight from classical sculpture. This figure here, where you see him lifting this body, this is from a very famous classical group of ancient sculpture of Hercules fighting one of the sons of Gaia. The story was that every time he would be thrown to the earth, he would regain his strength magically when he touched the earth, so Hercules had to squeeze him to death while holding him off the ground. This one is probably borrowed from a scene of Aeneas saving his father from Troy. So he's deliberately quoting classical art in this. But he got done, and he took away the scaffolding, and he looked up at it, and he considered it a complete failure. Even though these figures are very, very large, some of those figures in those paintings are nearly life-size, when you're looking up at it from, more than 50 feet below, you cannot see any of the detail at all. And he realized he was painting these figures far, far, far too small. So you can't really make out any, from the floor, you can hardly make out the scene of the flood, or of the sacrifice, or the drunkenness of Noah. Again, one of those stories in the Bible that no one ever talks about. But there it is. So he decided to change his tactics entirely. So when he went to the next section through here, he said, forget it, I'm not going to have these dense narrative scenes with dozens of figures. I'm going to have scenes with 1 or 2 figures, and these figures are truly going to be colossal. Some of these figures are more than 15 feet in length. And that way you can see them from the floor and you can read them, and they're far more dynamic. And in this case, the subject is not the flood, it's the creation. So as we go through these panels, you'll see God separating the waters. This is a story of the creation, that God separates the waters. There's waters above the firmament, which is the clouds, and the waters below the firmament, which is the seas. And you can see that God reaches out. Here you can see the extreme foreshortening. This is the kind of stuff that Mantegna was famous for, and Ghirlandaio was famous for, and you can see how he's learned that. This arm comes straight at you. So here is God, the Creator, flying at you, and I love how he's so heavy that the angels have to buoy him up. They have to kind of lift him up. You'll notice that he's a hands-on God. He doesn't just sit back and let things happen. He reaches forward and separates things. Again, we have a continuous narrative. Here he is separating the light from the darkness. Here is the light. His foreshortened arm comes at you, and then the other arm is back here separating the darkness. And then when he's done, he says, whoop, can't stick around, I gotta go, and he flies away like Superman, and you get a view of his fabulous glutes and all 10 piggies. Now that is just the wildest thing. You have to remember, this is God, and people were really offended by this. They were like, you just can't show God's backside, you can't show his feet. Those are considered to be not exactly the best parts of anatomy. And so to show God from behind was really kind of shocking. But at the same time it worked, because it showed God in motion, that God was active and dynamic in the creation. He wasn't just sitting back, just letting it happen. All of this ultimately culminates in the scene of the creation of Adam, which is in the dead center of the Sistine Chapel, where God, again, being buoyed up by all of his angels, reaches forward and almost touches the hand of Adam. Adam is this incredible classical nude laid out for all of us to see, and we have this beautiful figures. And again, he reaches forward to touch Adam. Now, many people have been curious and have tried to interpret what's going on. Why do we have such a dynamic hands-on God? And again, I have to remind you, an artist is subject to his patron. He is not a free person. He has to do what his patrons do. He's considered a craftsman. He's somebody you hire to do a job. But we can see that the artists are being elevated in status, and like Leonardo da Vinci and others, they're no longer considering themselves to be just artists. They're considering themselves to be intellectuals. We think of artists as intellectual people who have real comments and important things to say. And so Michelangelo is making a comment about the nature of art, I think. In this, you see God is not standing back and just, blinking his eyes and making things happen as if by magic. When you see depictions of the creation in medieval art, God is usually pretty remote. He doesn't, get hands-on and dirty. And, of course, you all are familiar with this phrase, I'm certain. It's rather derogatory. Or you say, well, that person is, works with his hands. What it's meant to be as a slam is that, people who work with their hands are not as smart as people who work with their brains. Now you can just insert any micro, monologue in here and we can fix that. I think it's actually insulting. People who work with their hands are actually very, very intelligent. And that's what I think Michelangelo is trying to say. He's trying to say, hey, artists are like God. God made the universe, and he worked with his hands, and you can't say he's dumb because he's the smartest thing in the universe. And so it portrays God in the role of an artist. And I think that's probably what he's trying to say here. He's trying to elevate the status of the artist by making these comparisons between God and man. So as we go around to some of the other figures, we have a fascinating collection of figures. We have scenes of the relatives or the ancestors of Christ, but we also have these very powerful figures of prophets and sibyls. These are massive heroic figures. And of course, these are all prophets or figures who tell the story of Christ. These are people who prophesy about the coming of Christ. I think this is Daniel here, and this woman, and yes, this is a woman. Oh my gosh, look at her guns. Amazing, but definitely a woman. I think this is the Cumaean Sibyl. We also have this beautiful image of the Libyan Sibyl. Gorgeous picture, and again, look at her arms. This musculature is what Michelangelo saw as being evidence of kind of the epic classical quality. Remember, he was looking at Hellenistic statues. That's why, Hellenistic statues seem to be amped up like on steroids. So that's why he did it. Now, you may be wondering, who are these people? I've heard of prophets. If you've read your Bible, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, you've heard of prophets. Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. But who the heck is the Libyan Sibyl? Where is she in the Bible? Turns out she's not in the Bible. It turns out none of these characters are in the Bible. This is the Delphic Sibyl. The Delphic Sibyl was actually a pagan prophetess. So if you remember my 2710 class, go back and look at the section on Delphi. Delphi was the sanctuary to Apollo, a pagan god. And there were these priestesses, the Pythian priestesses, and they would be set on a tripod, and they would utter out the words of the prophecies of the god Apollo, describing the future as it could happen. So you may be asking yourself, what is a pagan prophetess doing on a Christian ceiling? As it turns out, the Delphic Sibyl made a prophecy way, way back about a golden age and a child that would come and establish this golden age. Now, for the pagans, everybody argued about who this child was supposed to be. Was it Alexander the Great? Was it Augustus? There were many different possibilities. But Christians looking back at this tradition say, wait a minute, that could have been Jesus. And so it's a fascinating way of bringing the classical tradition into the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think that's what's really remarkable about this entire ceiling. When you look at something like the creation of Adam, it is no longer purely Judeo-Christian. It has this humanistic appeal. It is bringing the classical tradition. And just to drive the point home, we have these pagan prophetesses on the walls who are now written in as part of the official Judeo-Christian tradition. And even more so when we look at these ignudi, that you'll notice that there's an awful lot of naked people around here. Let's take a look at one. Let's take a look at this guy here. And everybody asks me, okay, I get the creation, I get the prophetesses, I get all of that, but what are the naked guys for? And the naked guys are there just because naked guys say awesome. That's it. That's what they're for. That the male nude in classical art was a way of designating the space that was meant to be a sacred space or an elevated or an epic space. And so what could be more epic than Christianity and the triumph of God and the creation of God? So we're going to bling this out with nudes everywhere. And they literally are everywhere, all over the ceiling. You know, some may represent kind of allegorical ideas, but they're there to add epic weight to the entire scene. And these figures are going to be based on, again, classical examples like the Belvedere torso. The Belvedere torso is this famous Hellenistic work of art that was in the Vatican collection, and so he could go and look at it and see that. And if you'll notice, the thing about Hellenistic art is that they never left a muscle unflexed. Every single muscle is jazzed and totally juiced out, and like massive steroid abusers. You can see all of these serratus anterior muscles are just, oh my gosh. You know, not even in Marvel movies do we get people this ripped. And you can see this in his preparatory drawings, how he really was. He wanted all of this muscle because, even on the women, because this was the thing that gave this an air of classical epic, you know, power. That's what he wanted. Well, we can't talk about the Sistine Chapel without talking about the restoration. In the late 80s and early 1990s, the entire thing underwent a massive restoration. And the problem is that this is a church, and a church is going to have candles, it's going to have soot and incense, and all of that soot gathers up on the surface, and it really darkens it. Now, as this happens over the centuries, people realized this was diminishing the paintings, and so you would freshen it up by applying a layer of lacquer, of, you know, kind of varnish to the surface. The problem is that varnish collects even more dirt. So lather, rinse, repeat, 300 years later, there's a lot of layers of lacquer. A lot of kind of incompetent restorers had placed lacquer, and now we had something like 30, 40 layers of lacquer on this thing, and it was very dark, and it made the images completely unintelligible anymore. And so the decision was made to actually remove the lacquer. Now the problem with varnish is you can remove all of the layers of varnish, but you can't remove just one layer of varnish. And so you might be thinking, well, big deal, just remove all the varnish and get back to it. And you can see the difference between how dark it was and how light it was once they removed the varnish. The problem is, art historians had kind of gotten used to the way it looked, and they assumed that Michelangelo had put down the first layer of varnish. Michelangelo was an experimenter just like Leonardo. They were trying to give fresco the same kind of qualities as oil painting. So there was this supposition, there's no proof of this, but there was the supposition that the first layer of varnish was put down by Michelangelo. Now the problem is you can't separate layers of varnish, it's all or nothing. But the Vatican made the decision to strip out all of the layers of varnish. And this was extraordinarily expensive. Excuse me. At the end of the day, it was actually funded by a Japanese television station and a Japanese bank. And they did this for the exclusive rights to film this. So, you know, it's kind of amazing. So the reproduction rights for many years were owned by Japan. It's kind of crazy. Interesting world. And it caused an enormous scandal. A lot of art historians felt like this really diminished the original work. But at the end of the day, we have to say there's no evidence that Michelangelo actually put on a first layer of varnish. We honestly don't know. And certainly you can tell that, you know, before the colors were very dingy, they were illegible. You couldn't even make out characters and figures in this. And the idea that Michelangelo wanted these figures not to be seen is pretty remarkable. When you look at the restoration and the bright, intense colors that it has, that seemed really foreign to people. But Michelangelo did do a few panel paintings, like the Donny Tondo. And when we look at his panel paintings, they have this same bright, vivid quality and color. And so, since what we have now after the restoration looks more like his original stuff in his panel paintings, I'm inclined to think that, well, maybe we removed something that Michelangelo put up there, but whatever we removed, whatever we have left, feels more like the few panel paintings we have left. That's a pretty good indication that the restoration was a good idea. I mean, people love it. I mean, if I saw it both before and after, and I can tell you it's a world of difference. You know, you just couldn't enjoy it before. So, you know, a few art historians, you know, get their feelings hurt because it's not what they expect, because it's not what they grew up with. But again, it goes back to, like, Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Do we like these things for what they really are, or do we like them because we have certain impressions and narratives built over time? You gotta be willing to let your, you know, your false assumptions go. So Michelangelo was also not just a sculptor and a painter, he also was an architect. And during his lifetime, they decided to tear down old St. Peter's and build a new church over the top of it, which is New St. Peter's. You can actually see this is the church of old St. Peter's here, and the new church is so big it could actually be built right over the top of it. And they actually didn't tear down old St. Peter's until the new church was built. It's kind of amazing. Now, several architects had had a go at this. Bramante, I wish I could tell you more about Bramante, but we've only got so much time. And Bramante had designed a plan that was a Greek cross plan. A Greek cross is a cross where all arms of the cross are equal. A Latin cross is a cross where the bottom arm here is a little bit longer. That's the difference. So Bramante designed this plan, but it probably wouldn't have been strong enough. The walls are too thin, and it was far too complex. It had too many features. And so Michelangelo took Bramante's plan and greatly simplified it and created something that had a lot more strength, both in terms of engineering, but also in terms of appearance. He also designed the dome for it, and this is the dome that's over the top of it. And you can see the inspiration of this dome in churches and Capitol buildings all throughout history. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C. ultimately owes its parentage to Michelangelo's designs. So we have this massive dome. And when we look at Old St. Peter's, it creates this incredibly robust, muscular space. As he got older, as we move into the 16th century, Michelangelo became increasingly experimental. One of his architectural fantasies, if you will, is this building. This is a building I know well because I actually did my dissertation on a book that's in this building. This is the Laurentian Library. And this is a small, teeny little vestibule into the library. And they commissioned him to redesign this vestibule. And instead of giving them a tiny little piece of, tiny little set of stairs, he created this thing. I mean, I cannot stress to you that the wall is like right here. The door into it is just that right there. So there's almost nothing in this room but stairs. My favorite description of this came from an art historian who said it, instead of a regular pair of stairs, he gives us a flow of lava. The center stairs are curved. They have curlicues on the side. It has two side aisles. Even when we look at the room as a whole, he does strange things like puts columns in niches and doubles them up and sets them on brackets. This is against every rule of classical architecture. And it shows that Michelangelo was becoming increasingly experimental. You can even see this in his sculpture. Many of his sculptures, he made 4 Pietas and he only ever finished the first one. Many of these sculptures become far more experimental, ecstatic. The figures are twisted. When we look at his Pietas, for example, instead of Christ resting serenely on the lap of Mary, his body is a jangly mess in diagonal forms. This one, the Rondinini Pietà, you can see how he never finished it. Eventually, at one point, he decided to carve away large chunks of it and start over again. But you can see it's so awkward the way that Mary struggles to hold the Christ's body up by his neck. And this is indicative of so many of the things that he did in his later career. He became far more experimental. His figures become more distorted. And we start to move away from the Renaissance into what we call mannerism. Now we'll talk more about mannerism in another lecture, in the next lecture, as a matter of fact. But mannerism, of course, takes classicism and starts to distort it. But you can probably give Michelangelo a credit for getting us in that direction towards mannerism. Towards the end of his career, Michelangelo lived a surprisingly long period of time. The far wall of the Sistine Chapel needed to be redone. And this time the Pope, Leo X, said, hey, look, you did the ceiling, and ever since you did the ceiling, I can't get anybody to touch this thing. Michelangelo's reputation was so huge. He was such a rock star. Nobody wanted to go in there and do it. And he said, so if you don't do it, nobody will. So 25 years after he finishes the Sistine Chapel, he comes back to do the far wall, and he gives people an absolutely bizarre but amazing and wonderful composition we call The Last Judgment. So just to orient you, I'll go back to the general view of the Sistine Chapel. So when you look into the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling is what he did between 1508 and 1512, and then in 1534 to 41, he comes back and he does this far wall, which is directly over the altar. So that kind of orients you on where this thing is in the Sistine Chapel. And it's a strange painting in so many ways. It's very agitated in its motion. Let me just break down the general areas for you. In the center, you have Christ, and this is the Last Judgment. So people are being called forth on the day of resurrection, and in the upper zone, we have the blessed. We have the saints and the people who are coming to heaven. Above them, we have angels with the armor Christi. Below, in the center, you have angels with trumpets who are calling people out of the graves. On the left side, we have the blessed rising out of their graves and being elevated to heaven, but on the other side, we have the damned being dragged down into hell. So let's start from the top. So at the very top, you have these images of the Armi Christi. These are angels bearing the cross and the crown of thorns and the column of flagellation. These are the objects used to torture Christ through his passion, but ultimately led to his triumph. And you just have to love how these angels almost seem to be fighting, you know. I mean, look at this character. Look at how he's bent over to carry this cross, or this figure here. It's really remarkable. In the center panel, you can see Christ, and Christ is surrounded by saints. Now here's where we get to the really weird stuff. When this was originally painted, Michelangelo painted every single person in this painting nude, from Jesus Christ to the Virgin Mary to all the saints and all the damned. Now, it had been conventional to show the damned as naked, because you go into hell naked. But Michelangelo's thinking on this was probably, well, you know, if you go to hell, you don't need clothes because you're going to be tortured and all your sins are exposed, so you're naked. But if you go to heaven, you're perfected, so why do you need clothes? So everyone was naked. Everyone was naked. And only Michelangelo could get away with this. Cardinals at the time thought this was just scandalous, but Michelangelo's reputation was such nobody was going to tell him no. 24 years later, the Council of Trent happens, and the Council of Trent says, no, we're done with this. And they condemned this kind of nudity, and so they had to get another artist, an artist by the name of Daniele da Volterra, and he comes and he paints the clothes onto these figures. So the clothes that you see on the Virgin Mary, the perfectly added little wisps of cloth that sweep in to cover people like Peter and etc. All of those were added by Volterra, but he did it incompetently. I mean, if you look at the colors don't match. He can't match one color from one day to the next, so the greens are constantly changing. And most people think he did an incompetent job, so he got the nickname Il Bragatone, or the pants painter. So if you thought Masaccio was a Clumsy Tom was a negative name, being the pants painter is a worse name. Eventually, when they restored this, they decided, this was an addition that probably, shouldn't be changed. So here's St. Catherine with the spiked wheel. The saints hold the various items with which they were tortured. St. Sebastian holds arrows. Bartholomew was skinned alive, so he holds his flayed skin. But you'll notice that her clothes aren't even the same color. You can't match the same color from one day to the next. but it's really funny. But notice how heroic and massive these figures are. Even the women, they're just absolutely ripped. So here are the angels, and the angels are holding forth the books of life, saying, hey, your name's in it or it's not. And they're blowing their trumpets. Some look like they're about to have a stroke. And calling people out of the grave. But I think my favorite part is all the people who are damned to hell and who are being dragged down. So here you have this person who in his shame is trying to cover himself, and demons and other figures are flying out, and they're completely grabbing him and dragging him down to hell. This is the best picture I could find. This was from before the restoration. But here you have Charon, the ferryman, which is a classical figure from classical mythology, and he's beating people out of the boat with an oar. There's so many people going down to hell. He has to beat them out with an oar, and they're all being shoved down to hell. So here is a detail of Charon, the ferryman, and then here you see this figure. This is generally regarded as Midas. Midas is a classical figure that had the ears of an ass. He's also the same Midas who had the Midas touch, that everything turned into gold. It's usually held up as an example of a foolish king. And the legend is that the French cardinal who criticized this when Michelangelo was painted, that this is a caricature of his face. And so forever he is painted as the foolish king, and he has a snake to gnaw on his genitals because, hey, that's great. You know, if you're in art, don't piss off artists or writers, because then they will make you infamous in their art and paint. Just a pro tip for the day. Okay, let's move on to Raphael. So Raphael's an interesting character because Raphael in personality is almost the exact opposite of Michelangelo. Raphael was known for being gregarious, magnanimous. He had a huge entourage of people that would go around with him. He wore very gay and colorful clothing, was very, very fashionable, etc. He had a number of mistresses. He really aspired to be a cardinal, but I think one of the cardinals said, you know, you have a bit too many mistresses to do this. So fabulous guy, real party boy. Michelangelo, on the other hand, would dress like a homeless person and had very few apprentices, had very few friends, and would wander the streets of Rome alone. And the legend is that the two of them met one day, and Michelangelo goes to Raphael and he says, what right do you have to, you know, walk around the cities as if you're some courtier? And Raphael looked back at him in his disheveled clothes and said, what right do you have to be a homeless person? I mean, you know, you're a famous artist. Why would you act this way? I've always loved that story, that, you know, you don't have a right to be miserable. He was he was active in Urbino, but also active in Rome. He comes from Urbino. He's a student of Perugino, so he learns that incredible mathematical perspective from them. Dies relatively young, so unfortunately we don't have a lot of work by Raphael compared to some of the others, but he does finish the Borgia apartments, which means he works for the same pope that commissioned the Sistine Chapel from Michelangelo, and so that's where we have these beautiful rooms, the Stanza della Signatura, the rooms of the signature. This was the room where they would sign treaties, but it was probably in Julius II's time his private library. What he's most noted for from Vasari is for the painting of Madonnas, that he has this beautiful you know, soft touch, and he just paints lots of these gorgeous Madonnas with these beautiful deep backgrounds. So here you can see the influence of Perugino, but you can also see some of the touch of Verrocchio as well. He has a tenderness towards his subjects that Michelangelo never has. Everybody in a Michelangelo painting is just on all the time. There's very little that's contemplative in a Michelangelo painting. It's just action. But Raphael's stuff has this wonderful contemplative and tenderness that people really commented on. And this is what made him a very successful portraitist. This is a portrait of Julius II. So this is the guy that beat Michelangelo over the head with his pope staff. Julius II is that very important humanist pope, and you can see that he paints him with this kind of, has this touch of melancholy. There's a sense of the character behind it. The most famous set of paintings that he does, of course, are the Stanza della Signatura. And these were, again, these were used in later times as a treaty signing room for the Vatican. That's why they're called the stanza, the rooms of the signature, because that's where you would sign treaties. But they were probably Julius II's library, and it gives an insight into his world. I've already commented on this in an earlier lecture, how one of the things that's interesting about the Humanist Pope is that we have classical and Christian themes right juxtaposed to each other. So here we have the Disputa. The Disputa is a discussion on the nature of the Eucharist. The Eucharist stands on the altar. We have the Trinity present here, and all of these prominent theologians, as well as church doctors and saints discussing it. But over here we have Apollo, who is the god of arts and sciences, on Mount Parnassus, surrounded by his muses and his acolytes as well. The most famous painting out of this cycle is going to be the School of Athens. The School of Athens is a very perplexing painting on some levels because it isn't a representation of a moment in time. If you think about the School of Athens, he's not talking about, say, a school photo of everyone who was in Athens circa, the 4th century. No. What he's talking about is all of the people who were ever influenced by the theories and philosophies of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So we have a wide array of figures from different historical time periods. We have Alexander the Great, we have Hypatia. Alexander the Great lived, of course, in the 4th century BC. Hypatia lives in the 4th century AD and is one of the last female Greek Neoplatonic philosophers. So we have a wide range of people from all times. So this is the metaphysical School of Athens, all of the people throughout time. We have a figure representing Apollo, god of art and sciences, and Athena, goddess of wisdom. When we look into the building, the architecture is clearly based on architecture from the Roman Forum that he could have seen. But when we think of the building looks like a church. It looks like St. Peter's, and people have postulated that what he's saying is that the church is the ultimate inheritor of all of this classical tradition. At the very center we have an image of the two most prominent figures of the School of Athens. We have Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And when we see these two figures, their gestures are telling everything that you need to know about them. They are both carrying books. In this case, Aristotle is carrying his Nicomachean Ethics, and Plato is carrying the Timaeus. And their gestures actually explain their philosophies. Plato points to the heavens. If you know Plato's philosophy, he believed in these higher forms, that we couldn't know the truth of anything, but there were higher forms that we couldn't experience. And Aristotle was like, nah, dude, the world can really be explained by the world we can see in front of us. That's why his hand extends forward to say that we can understand the world by observing the world through reason. And these two philosophies become the two competing philosophies in Western philosophy. But when we look at these characters and their faces, they should look kind of familiar. And it's been widely postulated that Plato here, this does not look like any classical image of Plato. It actually looks like Leonardo da Vinci. And this figure here looks like it could be Verrocchio. And so these are masters and intellectuals that Raphael would have been familiar with. And it's not just them. All over we have a collection of figures. In the front here and over here, we see a collection of figures that, if we look at them, have very interesting features. This figure here is Euclid. Euclid is the Greek father of geometry, but he has a bald head, and that he has the face that looks like the face of Bramante, who was an architect at the time. And in fact, if you go over here, we have a picture of Raphael himself, and standing next to him is Perugino. But he has depicted himself and his master as if they were Xenophon and Apelles, who were two famous artists from the classical world. Up front, dead center, we have Heraclitus. Heraclitus is this very kind of rough and tumble philosopher, but he gives him the face of Michelangelo. So it's very funny that he gives these philosophers this appearance. And in fact, if you look at the character's knees here, you notice these are pretty heavy, thick knees. This is not the way Raphael usually painted knees. So not only did he paint Heraclitus with Michelangelo's face, he painted him with the musculature that Michelangelo used. And so what is he saying by this painting? And I think it's pretty obvious. What he's saying is that just as these philosophers were the great philosophers of their time, so too are the artists of our time, the great thinkers and philosophers of our time. That we are a classical age akin to the great classical age. And so he gives these great famous historical figures the features of his friends and his colleagues. It's really quite a compelling way. It's saying the same thing that maybe the Sistine Chapel is saying, but in a different way. It's saying, hey, we need to elevate ourselves. We're not just artists, we're not just craftsmen, we're intellectuals, and we're intellectuals equal to the intellectuals of the past. There's one other section over here I want to show you, and that's over here. And here is the view of Hypatia, but over here you have a Muslim scholar. This is Averroes, more common known as Ibn Rushd or Ibn Rushd. And he is one of the great Aristotelian philosophers from the Muslim world. And it was his translation of Aristotle that goes on to be the inspiration of Western philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas and others. So he is still including all of those people that would have been inspired. Now, Raphael had something of a man crush on Michelangelo, so not only does he paint Michelangelo into his painting, but he even tried to emulate his style. He loved this heroic style. So he had a few commissions, and in one of these commissions, he does the Triumph of Galatea, this story out of classical mythology. And if you'll notice, you'll look at these figures, they look very overwrought. Even the women look overwrought and muscular. That's because he was trying to emulate Michelangelo's style. Vasari says that people said, yeah, you better go back to your original style. This epic style is not for you. Michelangelo's got that territory covered. And so Vasari says that he goes back to painting his Madonnas, and everybody's happy for it. So you can see that he does. This is the very famous Sistine Madonna. And here, you know, gosh, these angels have been reproduced endlessly. And you can again see this very soft, sensitive treatment. You know, some of the Madonnas and Childs in previous period, they don't really act like mothers or children, but here you can see the tenderness and the union between those, plus the rendering is just beautiful. You have to love this little angel with his hand above his lip. He has this wonderfully kind of bored expression. You get the sense that when Michelangelo paints women that he never ever really took a look at women, but when you get a sense of Raphael painting children, that he really did look at children and understand children and has a greater sensitivity in that regard. You can see that same kind of thing in this, one of his most famous paintings, The Transfiguration. Here we have two scenes. The scene above is the Transfiguration, and the scene below is a scene of the healing of a boy who is taken with a demonic spirit. And this was probably commissioned by Giulio de' Medici, who would later go on to be Pope Clement VII. And the message here is, again, to show the importance or primacy of Christ. The story of the Transfiguration is the story of Christ going up to Mount Tabor, and there is an epiphany, or a theophany. A theophany is a scene where God reveals himself as God, and so Christ reveals himself to his apostles, Peter, James, and John, and then appearing next to him are Moses and Elijah, who come to him. And the story here is a story of the saints and the apostles trying to heal a boy, but not being able to do it. So the connection is not really readily apparent, but it says that ultimately things have to come through God. This is that episode where he says, this kind doesn't come out except by prayer and fasting, and that ultimately everything has to be done in the name of God and giving Christ primacy. Well, that seems like a good place to end this lecture. I don't want to go long. I didn't get the chance to talk about the Northern Renaissance, which is equally important, so I think we'll start the next lecture with the Northern Renaissance. Thanks so much.